Good morning, everybody. Hope you're all hanging in there. This is the last day of week 10. So we've got 5 more weeks left to go. So we're on this side of the semester. We're making it. We're going through. So yeah, hope you're all doing okay. It's been an intense week. I feel like I say that every week, but that's just sort of been 2020, right? So good morning, welcome. And we're going to talk about both of the articles that we read for this week. And so that we're all caught up. Friendly reminder that tomorrow your second blog post is due. So I'm looking forward to reading those. And let's see, what else? Anything else in the way of sort of announcement-y things? If you can, early vote, strongly recommended. If you have not mailed in your mail-in ballot, do not mail it. The Postal Service is far too delayed for it to get where it needs to be on time. So find your local ballot drop box or take it to or have a trusted friend take it for you to a polling station and drop it off at the actual voting center. Those are both completely legitimate ways to turn in your mail-in ballot that is not the U.S. Postal Service, which we love, but which has been systematically sort of gutted this year. So we just want to make sure that if you are voting this year, if you are eligible to vote and you are voting this year, that your ballot gets where it needs to be when it needs to get there. So friendly reminder there as well. I voted weeks ago by mail, but I was recently in DC for an appointment and very near 2 polling centers. So early voting is open in DC now. So if you are in DC and you do get to vote in DC, then you can do that. Of course, if you are absentee voter, you've got that down as well. Just remember, don't put your ballots in the mail. The deadline for that has passed. So you can put them in the mail, but there's no guarantee that they'll get there on time and be counted. And we want your vote to count. So let us get to our discussions today. We'll be talking about Bailey and Mobley's Black Feminist Disability Framework, and we'll be talking about McClure's Disabling Sex. And you all watch the documentary film Sex Abled as well, which it's a really short film. It's like, I think it's 20 minutes, I remember. Thereabouts. And it is, so hopefully it helped you sort of reorient your mind. And it's really interesting in the article that Bailey and Mobley talk about, they talk about the documentary Murder Ball. And they talk about it because it's missing any kind of sort of racial intersectional analysis. But I have shown that documentary before as well, and it is a good documentary to watch for its perspective on disability. But again, right, it is missing that really important piece, and so you can watch it and take from it the disability and crip theory pieces, but also critique it and keep in mind, right, Bailey and Mobley's arguments about why it's limited. It doesn't go it doesn't cover all of the aspects that it needs to or should, or that a comprehensive activism, right, a comprehensive praxis, a comprehensive theorizing, a comprehensive anthropology, for example, a holistic view would take into consideration, right? Sorry, my camera is just not quite up for it this morning. Got funky glares happening. So we're going to talk about all of those things, and we'll talk about McClure's article, and we'll try to incorporate a little bit of Bailey and Mobley's Black feminist critique into that article as well. So we're going to kick off there and keep cracking. So welcome. Let's get started. All right. So we've been talking about the body, right? So anthropology of the body, and so we've talked about that through the concepts of race, gender, sexuality, right? And now we're talking about disability, and this week weaves in really all of those things that we've talked about: race, gender, sexuality, and adds on the intersection of the layer of disability as well, right? So all of these different ways that bodies are labeled, right? All of these different ways that bodies are, right, that they're theorized, right? That these categorizations are made, and also, right, on the lived experience side, right? So that the other side is sort of edic, right? It's outside of the body. It's assigned to the body from someone else, right? Or from something else, right? That is how power works on our bodies, right? What happens in our bodies, right, is the emic experience. It's how we experience our bodies, and how we ascribe to or do not ascribe to, right? How we disidentify or how we resist the labels of that sort of power assigns to us, right? No, that's not what I just want y'all to be able to see me as I'm talking a little bit, in case that is helpful. But right, so we're talking about these different ways, and keep in mind that disability is not just right. Disability is an umbrella term. It encompasses a great many things, right? Just like gender, just like sexuality, race is also entails a lot of different categories, but we know much more specifically what race refers to, right? Gender and sexuality get a little more right, varied in terms of what exactly gets sort of pulled in under those umbrella terms. So I just want to clarify that disability also, so it includes the physical body, right? But it also includes things that are not seen, right? Invisible illnesses or disabilities, right? So chronic illness, for example, mental health, certainly can be incorporated into these things, right? And so there's also some it's also a contested category, right? Disability, and how it gets used is how it is claimed as an identity, and how it is resisted as an identity is also very important. So we're going to Bailey and Mobley touch on some of those aspects just a little bit, and so I want to keep that. And so I just want to preface what we're going to talk about with that notion, so that we don't have a too narrow definition of disability, right? Okay, so, oh, I did it again. Darn it. I forgot to put in my what do you call it? The animations. So you're just going to get hit with all of this information at once. Please just take it one sort of discussion point at a time, right? It proposes a framework to bring disability and race into disability studies. Here, I have a solution for this. No, it's this. Right. So proposes a framework to bring disability into race studies and race into disability studies, right? This Black feminist disability framework, right? So again, this is sort of a theoretical way of understanding, for understanding and for theorizing and for analyzing the world around us, right? Human relations and the body, right, in particular. So there's a whole entire, do I have that reader? I don't think that I do. No, not handy. There's a whole entire body of literature, the anthropology of the body, right? So then there's also, right, Bailey and Mobley highlight a few underlying themes, right? The origin of ideas and beliefs about how Black bodies, and by extension, any non-white body, right, are expected to look, be, and act, right? So what are the origins, right? And we've talked a lot about epistemology in this class, and the origin of ideas, and not just the origin of ideas, but how we know what we know, the cultural context that through which ideas develop and become hegemonic, become dominant ideas, become the mainstream, right? So we've talked about that a lot, and we'll continue to talk about it because it really does inform everything, right? How we know what we know, and the assurance that what we know is a truth, right? Or is the truth, right? Is what then justifies a great many actions and policies and systems, right? So they also talk about the medical model of disability, right? Pathologizing disabled bodies. So let me say a few words about that. And this is part of what I was getting to when we were talking about, or when I was talking about the different sort of ways that disability, the label of disability, right, the categorization of disability is assigned to people, but it's also a way that this medicalization of disability, right, the pathologizing of it, is one of the ways in which, or one of the arenas in which there is pushback and resistance to the label of disability, right? Or the characterization of disability in these very specific ways. So what does that mean, pathologizing, right? So we talked about pathologizing behavior, pathologizing power, right? And this really just is part of the ways that, I mean, as a medical anthropologist, I deal with this all the time, and admittedly sometimes take the concept for granted, right? As obvious, but pathologizing, right? We're talking about a medical term, pathology, right? Something that is wrong, something that is sick, something that is wrong in the sense of abnormality or potentially life-threatening, right? Something that needs to be cured, right? So this is one of the big problems with pathologizing language, is that it assumes that there is one right way to be, right? And that different abilities, different physical appearance, right? Different variations in physiology, conditions, right, are things that are categorically, right, problematic, right, or that make that prevent people from having a good life, right? And so we're gonna get to that momentarily, right? So this medical model of disability, right, is that there is some pathology that needs to be cured or fixed, right? So missing a limb means that we have to somehow change the body or change the appearance of the body so that it looks like you have all of your limbs, right? So prostheses and things like that, right? This is not to say that there is anything wrong with prosthetics for people who want them, right? But it really is, it's also about a radical body politics that says that my body is fine the way that it is, right? That that my body is good enough with one leg instead of two, for example, or one arm instead of two, or no arms and no legs, right? I can still be a full valued member of society, right? Where my mobility or the number of appendages attached to my body don't dictate my worth or my value, or um, how I am able to fashion a life worth living for myself, right? Other people don't get to decide what my quality of life is. And we'll talk about that, an example of why that becomes really important, and how that, right, in the ways that Bailey and Mobley are talking about, how that really gets magnified when you add the intersectional layers, right? So if we're talking about Black, queer, disabled bodies, right? Who gets to decide quality of life or what is a good life, right? Is much more, becomes much more nefarious and problematic often, right? Bodily autonomy is stripped away at a faster rate, right? So bodily autonomy, or in anthropology, sort of what we frequently call agency, right? These terms are similarly, they're not one for one interchangeable, but they're pretty close, right? So when we hear bodily autonomy, what they mean is one's ability to decide what happens to their own body, one's ability to do with their bodies what they want, right? And so this happens both in accepting or resisting care. This happens in accepting or resisting power. This happens in engaging or not engaging in romantic relationships, in sexual relationships, in all manner of things, right? Whether or not, to take, I don't know, whether or not to, really anything. I mean, whether or not to take a shower every day or not, right? These are the sort of bodily autonomy. I mean, it gets way more complicated, obviously, but this is what they mean by bodily autonomy, like my ability to decide what happens to my body, and the and in theorizing this, right, in the ways that we've been talking about power, the ways that my bodily autonomy is or isn't restricted, right? And so I'm just using my here as an example. You can use those exact same words and think about yourself, right? Or use one's or someone's, right, bodily autonomy. It's not just, right, this isn't about, it's not about me, but I'm using myself as the example here for illustrative purposes, right? So, and then the other issue is, right, the good life, right? Or what constitutes a good life, right? And that's a very subjective term. There is no objective good life, right? And and which again makes this a question that anthropology is particularly well suited to exploring and answering, right? Because we use these qualitative methods to understand these things, and we don't assume objectivity or objective uh, um, answers, right? Objective rationales when we are talking about human endeavors, human bodily politics, especially, right? So the good life, then, right, is this way in which, or is this way of sort of categorizing existence, right? The lived experience. But it's also like there is sometimes like an archetype or an ideal, but it's constantly, right? The goal goal is constantly moving, right? So they're constantly moving the finish line, or changing it, right? Changing what it means and what it is, so that really there is no single good life. It truly is case by case. And up to the person living that life to decide if it's good or not, right? So one of the places where this becomes extremely problematic, right, is in eugenics and deciding whose life is worth living, right? So this is one of the reasons that things like genetic studies to eliminate certain genetic conditions or things like that through genetic modification, right, or creating designer babies, right, becomes a really a really intense ethical and philosophical debate, right? Because there are people who live full and happy lives, right? Who um, who who would be written out of existence if this sort of technology existed before, right? Or if this were a common practice, right? If it were decided that their life wasn't good and worth living, right? So it's not so much right. The decisions often get made from this ableist standpoint, from the perspective of people who are able-bodied or who fit more carefully into the box of normal, right? What has been deemed normal, and they're the ones deciding, oh, I would never be able to live like that, or oh, how could somebody live like that, or oh, that's not a good quality of life, right? And what they really mean is that's not what I expect my quality of life to be, right? It's not what they're doing is projecting their own fear and also ignorance, sort of in the sense of not in the sort of derogatory way, but really in their lack of knowledge and understanding about a subject or a situation, right? And so it's those decisions, like what gets described as the good life, or a life worth living, can be really exclusive and erasing, in a form of erasure for people. It can be a form of linguistic violence, certainly, but it can be it can result in real harm, real physical harm, right? Real experienced harm. To people with disabilities, right? So keeping all of these things in mind, right? We can also consider how eugenics plays a part in this. And this relates also to McCruer's article and Six Abled, right? The documentary that we watched. In that, right, there for the longest time were attempts to prohibit, right, uh, consensual sexual behavior uh, between um, uh, disabled people, or questions about relationships between um, uh, uh, people with disabilities and people without disabilities, right? Um, and certainly there are important power dynamics that have to be considered, right? But the assumption that someone with a disability does not have the power to consent, is not intelligent enough to know what is going on with their bodies and what's going on around them, right? Um, is incredibly problematic, right? It's a complete denial of agency. It's a complete denial of bodily autonomy. And it assumes that because someone is disabled, they are stupid or incapable of making decisions for themselves, right? So there are a couple of like popular films that have come out recently. One of which explores this particular concept in some really interesting ways, I think. Not that there aren't ways in which we can critique them, but I definitely think that if we focus on the issues of autonomy and decision making, and the ways that society attempts to control or limit the abilities, right, and ignore sort of what in radical educational pedagogy, right, we talk about in terms of like asset-based approaches, right? If we focus on that aspect, I think there are some good examples. Peanut Butter Falcon is one of the most recent films. It's a lovely, fun film, but I really I don't know that everyone appreciates the themes of autonomy, and there are definitely ways in which that film gets it super wrong, but there are ways in which it really pushes the issue of bodily autonomy and the issue of self-determination for someone with Down syndrome, and so I think, in that regard, it's definitely got some merit. There's also a film called "Don't Worry, He Won't Get Far on Foot." It is a biopic. It's a sensationalized Hollywood biopic, but it's really interesting, and it deals with a number of things. It deals with addiction. It deals with recovery. It deals with but it also deals with disability, and in some interesting ways, right? Again, not a perfect example, right? But really interesting. And then there's a documentary called which is really well has been really well received in the disability activism community, called Crip Camp. It's available on Netflix, I think. I can't remember where all of these films are available, but you should be able if you have a streaming service, you will probably be able to find them on one of the many out there. And if not, many of these are probably available through the university library, especially the popular ones, the popular hit movies, or the Hollywood movies, what I mean by popular, right? Crip Camp, very popular documentary, but not a popular like Hollywood film. So at any rate, those are some examples, right, of ways that these discussions are still that they're being entertained in the media, right, in our popular media, but also like, for example, with the documentary in Crip Camp, the way that they're being talked about in real life, in real time. Okay, so so those are some of the overarching things. The themes. They also talk about the myth of some of the myths, right, that undergird these ideas and what the consequences of those myths are. So that Black bodies have a higher tolerance for pain, right? So this relates back to that biological determinism. It also relates back to that racialized, racist, settler colonialist rationale, right, that says that Black bodies handle pain better or are stronger, which makes them ideal for physical labor, right, or enslavement, right? So these are the same logics that are working, right? Which is why I constantly go back to epistemology, right? Because it's that same underlying idea. If we go back to Belisa de Jesus and Pierre's article, right, about global white supremacy and the ways that they're talking about this being part of the analysis, part of the way that the common thread through all of these systems and the ways that bodies are shaped, maneuvered, manipulated, and the sort of causes of resistance to those very power structures, right? That's what they're talking about. So there's this myth, right, that then also results in the trope of the strong Black woman. And what Bailey and Mobley are talking about, right, is the ways that works to erase the lived experiences of Black disabled women, for example, right, who do not conform to this trope, right, in the archetypical sense, right? It's not saying that people with disabilities are not strong, right? But it doesn't fit this archetype, this ideal, right? This fictional, mythical existence, right? It doesn't fulfill the white fantasy, right, of the strong Black woman, right, which is what it is, right? So when I say white fantasy, I'm talking about this, the logic that is under that underpins this, right? The sort of racist historical roots of the biological differences between white bodies and Black bodies, and any non-white bodies, right? But most acutely and most directly targeting Black bodies, right? So what results, right, is this way in which these kinds of experiences are then have real consequences for real bodies, right? So it's problematic because it denies people the full experience of humanity. So in the same ways that I was talking about, the ways that toxic masculinity, right, or the archetype of hegemonic masculinity limits the full experience of humanity for people who are supposed to perform and meet the ideal, right, the fantasy of hegemonic masculinity, right? The same logic works here, right? Because it's the same logic that it is the same logics that are defining these identities, these ways of being, right? And so it's problematic because it denies this full range of human experiences. It denies the full experience of humanity. It denies people subjected to this trope, right, the space and opportunity to feel sad, to feel fear, to feel tired, to feel to be vulnerable, right? Anything that is often um, categorized, right, as weak, not because it is weak, but because again, in this logic, right, we define things by what they are not, right? And so if those are the things that are categorized as not strong, right, then they are by definition weak, right? And it limits our ability to feel these things, and because or the acceptability, right, I should say, because we experience them. And then therein lies the problem, right? Because we do experience them because they are, right, the part of the full range of the human experience. When we experience them, but we've been told that these are undesirable qualities, these are antithetical to the archetype, to the ideal, then we feel shame and guilt or ostracism or other negative we have other negative self-image, or if other people are experiencing these things, right, we assign negative attributes to that as well, right, from an outsider perspective onto someone else, right, which then compounds guilt and shame and feelings of lower value, lower worth, all of those kinds of things, right? And that is a powerful form of violence. Right? It's not, a physical punch to the gut, but the effects of that kind of emotional violence and constant degradation, right, do have measurable, noted long-term negative physical effects, right? So it may as well be a punch to the gut. So it erases these experiences. It erases the possibility of these experiences, and the existence, as a result, as well, of disabled Black bodies that are designated as weak and thus do not fulfill the white fantasy of the strong Black woman. Right? Okay, so we can keep those tropes in mind, right? These examples of these tropes, right? And the myths from which they emerge, right? And how those archetypes, right? You can also think about these things as the ways that the hypersexualized bodies, right? Where the origins of that comes from. We'll talk about that just a bit more in a minute, hopefully. Not a lot of time today. It feels like it's moving very quickly. So the implications of this, right? It goes beyond Black femme disabled bodies, right? In addressing the needs of the most vulnerable, right? The Bailey and Mobley, right, are also addressing all these categories of other people as well, right? This is one of the reasons, right, when it's the same logic that applies to, right, when one of the reasons when that Black Lives Matter, right, exists, right, is because the leaders of that movement, right, and who have a praxis, right, they have a theoretically informed action, understand that that it's not just words that none of us is free until all of us is free, right? That's not just like a pithy, you know, bumper sticker, right? It really is, if we address and attend to and care about the needs of the most marginalized, the most sidelined, the most forgotten about, we will at the same time be addressing the needs of everyone, right? And so this is what I mean when I'm talking about when I'm summarizing Bailey and Mobley in this way. And this is also what they mean, right? But this is also how we use, how we incorporate a Black feminist disability framework into analysis of other things that it may not obviously apply to, right? If we're so focused on the literal, right, then we can't actually do the work of abstraction, the work of theorizing, and the work of imagining a different way for the world to be, right? So consider their questions, Bailey and Mobley's questions, about the way our capitalist society works. I'm gonna just pull up, right? Let's see. Where they, right? So they say, disability studies questions how jobs are structured, the impossibility of a 5-day work week for everyone, and the demand that everyone work. Not only are some jobs debilitating, some people are unable to work. How might we reimagine our labor organizing if we do not assume that everyone should work to get their needs met? How might we restructure society itself if we could meet our needs without working jobs, however dignified and humane they might become? Right? So they are challenging here assumptions about our current neoliberal capitalist framework model of society that says that our worth, our value, is tied to our ability to work. And McClure gets into this in talking about Stone's analysis in a slightly different way, but related. And I'm going to try to get to that in a minute. But right, the way that work determines our worth, not just for people who are disabled, right, or who have disabilities, right, but for everyone, right? It just affects people with disabilities more, right, in different ways, right? So again, addressing this, right, actually reconfiguring such a model would improve the lives and experiences of Black disabled women, right? Taking that Black feminist framework, disability framework, sort of literally, right? But also remembering, right, bell hooks, reminder that feminism is for everyone. And feminism isn't about just women, right? Feminism is about equality. It's about equity, right? So reconfiguring a model that tells us that our worth is tied to our work, our productivity through work, right? Through holding a job, right? Reconfiguring that model would also reorient our ideas, for example, about masculinity and gender roles as tied to work and the kinds of work, right? Which we've read about as having caused problems for factory workers, like those in Downsizing Masculinity, right? When we were talking about the Maytag workers, one of the big problems was that they were losing their jobs, but their entire identities, their entire sense of masculinity and worth and value to their society, to their families, to themselves, to other men, right? It was determined by their work, right? And so if we reconfigure that entirely, right? It changes how we value people, right? And what we value in people. Many of you have been in or lived in DC for a brief period of time. Some of you probably longer. So some of you have been here for a few years at least. Some of you may be from the DC area. But one of the most commonly asked questions, and one of the most loathsome questions, one of the questions that people hate most, is, what do you do? Right? That is a very DC question to ask. And I should say it's a very sort of working, a very sort of, there's a specific population that asks those questions, right? But what do you do, right? This question does a few things. It assigns or it assumes you're interesting because of the work that you do. It assumes that you work, and it assumes your value as a result of your work. And part of that is because people want to use you to network, right? What do you do? Oh, can I use that? Oh, is that useful to me? Oh, can I say that I know somebody who does something interesting, right? But it also, right, is this question that asks us to define ourselves by our work, right? It underscores the very sort of ideological problem that Bailey and Mobley are talking about in terms of making shifting from an ableist, a capitalist sort of ideological foundation to one that values people as people, but also values the different ways in which we are creative, in which we are, in which we live our lives, the things that an asset-based approach, the things that we do and can do and want to do, versus the things that we are expected to do because they are profitable to someone else, right? And so, right, so the pandemic has also sort of underscored these arguments in really specific ways. In my medical anthropology class, we explored this theme a little more deeply, but there are a number of articles that came out in the Post, in the Atlantic, in the New York Times, in a variety of places that were sort of policy opinions and evaluations from people who've been working in on ADA accommodations advocacy for eternity, who've been working in disability studies, people who themselves have been advocates as workers with disabilities, right? The pandemic has really underscored their arguments because all of a sudden, right, it illuminates their points, especially about the infrastructure of work, the ableist infrastructure of work, literally the built environments in which we work in, right? Disability activists have been agitating for work from home accommodations forever, for a decade at least, but decades certainly, right? And incorporating models of universal design into work environments, into classrooms, into all of these different places, right? And it's always been met with resistance, or people talk about policymakers, able-bodied individuals or ableist individuals, I'll say, right? Because I also do not subscribe to the idea that someone with a disability isn't also able-bodied in a variety of ways, right? Which is the point, you know. But it's always been met with resistance or arguments about how it's not cost effective, or how, which is ludicrous, honestly, because the political economist in me and the health economist in me is like, are you mad? You don't have to pay for physical infrastructure and rent of an enormous building, and all of these sorts of things if you let people work from home, right? It's better for the environment. It's better for like much wider participation. It's better in every imaginable way, right? But for some reason, you still want it to be like this exclusive, impossible to accomplish for certain groups, certain categories of people, right? Rather than do these things that are actually quite simple. And what the pandemic revealed was, in fact, it is quite simple. Within days, entire industries shifted to work from home models, right? With very little difficulty, right? The vast majority of the entire federal government went to work from home models. So it's not that it is hard, right? It's not that it is difficult. It literally is an issue of political will. And it's not that it's more costly. What has been costly are industries and businesses that that cannot function in these kinds of ways, right? And we've seen that, but enabling people, right? Creating accessible environments, right, is not what's expensive. Having inaccessible environments is. It's also extremely exclusionary. Okay, so then I have some examples. I want to get to McCrure real quick. So maybe I'll just share the examples after we get to this. But McCrure is talking about sexuality, right, with regards to people with disabled bodies, right, or bodies that are perceived as disabled, right? So it includes the dimensions of sexuality, to the conversation about autonomy, about bodies and bodily autonomy, and what disabled bodies are expected or not expected to do, be, and look like, right? Highlights yet more paradoxes particular to ableism and racism and sexism and homophobia, or cis heterosexism, right? And talk specifically about desire and desirability. So we can think back also to Lord's discussion of the erotic and Lane's analysis as well, right, which incorporates those ideas, right? McCrure notes that within the current power systems and paradigms, desirability and desire are at odds, right? That disability is undesirable, right? Both in the sense that it is not valued, but also that it is not viewed as attractive or sexually desirable, right? That this is the sort of hegemonic discourse. This is the idea, right? But then makes the arguments that is not the case. And then, of course, we watched Sex-Abled, right, which is a documentary about sexuality and disability and the ways that those very much go hand in hand, right? So then what is it? What is this obsession, right, with or what is this tendency to desexualize or render asexual people who have disabilities, right? Or yeah, where does that obsession come from, right? And so McClure talks about it a little bit in terms of like history. Again, goes back to this sort of medicalizing and pathologizing of the disabled body as a way to control it, as a way to as an issue of public hygiene. The eugenics argument gets folded in there, right? Because the ideas that of people with disabilities procreating, right, having sex to reproduce, much less enjoy pleasure, right? And Audre Lorde has helped us already understand the dissociation of our bodies with pleasure, right? And so we have we have some tools to understand that component of this, right? But there's also that eugenics thing, that the desire, because disability is undesirable, both in terms of how we value people, right? And fear about the propriety of anyone with disabilities getting to enjoy themselves having sex, much less reproduce, right? Becomes this question in an ableist society, right? Again, debating, right? People who will never have to worry about these things, debating the existence, debating the where's, whys, and hows of existence of people who are different than them, right? But who all the same are people, right? So why do they get to decide? So one thing too I want to point out about McClure's article, right, is that Bailey and Mobley would still argue that McClure is missing an important racial analysis. Right? So not only in this issue of sexualization, which can get sticky, right? Or sexuality, right? Which can get sticky because when we think about, right, if we're talking about a Black feminist disability framework, and we think about the ways that, so there's this, the strong Black woman trope, right, which sort of renders invisible the Black disability experience, right? But then we have the trope of the sexually promiscuous or the hypersexualized Black woman's body, right? Or the hypersexualized Black body in general, right? Black men's bodies were sexualized in different ways, but still seen as and seen as threatening, but again in different ways, right? No less problematic, but right, but it worked for power in different ways, through different avenues, right? But that complicates this idea of the sexuality of, or the sexualization of Black femme disabled bodies, right? Because perhaps the question then is, how does that complicate it, right? It's certainly right. So we don't want to contribute to a hypersexualization of bodies, but at the same time, right, we're talking about a group of people whose identity has been rendered invisible. So in that way, there's a little bit more freedom, right? Maybe this sort of inverted, weird use of the term privilege, as Stone is using it, right? In that they can do whatever they want, and it doesn't become this issue because their bodies are not, they're ignored in such a way, right? Or maybe it becomes even more transgressive, right? So these are sort of questions then that, putting these authors and their analyses into conversation, this framework could push our analysis that much further, right? I do want to touch on like the last quick thing, and we'll have to cut it short there. But so there is this conversation about privilege, right? In McClure's article, and he's going through what another disability theorist is talking about, right? Stone. Right, there's this conversation that gets a bit convoluted in the article. But McClure's talking about the ways that our economic distribution is based on work, right? Going back to Bailey and Mobley, we were just talking about that, right? Which presupposes the able-bodied. The category of disability is meant to create space or exception for people who for people to work, right, in a different way, but still participate, right, in this ableist model and infrastructure, right? So the accommodations that are made, rather than sort of reconfiguring an inclusive infrastructure from the get-go, right, having to go back after the fact and make these accommodations and arguing that they're burdensome in the process, right? So this category of disability is created to create space or the exception for people with disabilities to work or to receive income if a disability prevents them from working, right, in the form of Social Security disability income, right? And this is the thing that they're talking about. So Stone and McClure are noting the cynical ways in which these exceptions are portrayed by able-bodied people, right, as privilege, right? And also goes back to what Bailey and Mobley are talking about in terms of the ways that our value is assigned to our work and therefore also to our income, right? But it's a privilege, right? Because in this argument, right, that Stone and McClure are highlighting, right, they're not arguing this is the case. They're arguing that this is how it is framed, right? That it's a privilege because, oh, well, you have a disability, you're not working, right? And if we apply the racial analysis to this, the Black feminist disability framework, right, then we can also see how that plays out in the negative talk, the opposition to disability income, right? The opposition to welfare, right? And especially to Black women on welfare, right? So if you are a Black disabled woman who is unable to work as a result of a disability, right? You are on SSDI, right? But you aren't working, so you're not valued, right? You are not fulfilling the white fantasy of the strong Black woman, right? And then there are a whole bunch of other sort of arguments that get in here, that get thrown in there. A lot of other characterizations and racisms and ableisms and things like that, right? Lots of classisms as well, right? So this is why it's sort of this cynical way in which this is portrayed as a privilege, or could be portrayed as a privilege, right? The problem is that the system doesn't work in quite such an egalitarian way. It's like, oh yeah, these were created as an exception so that things are accessible, when in reality that's not the context in which they were created. They were created because disability activists agitated for them, but they were relinquished, right, with a lot of complaint. And to this day, a lot of complaint. And in the past 3 years, concerted attempts have been made to roll back the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the accommodations that were hard fought for and hard won decades before, right? So this isn't about egalitarianism, right? So disability discrimination and ableist institutional and infrastructural standards, literally, right, the built environments, box people with disabilities out or decide for them what they can and can't do, right? Limits that agency, but also decides, you have a disability, you must not be able to do this, or you must not, this is obviously out of the realm for you, without actually without actually letting the person who wants to work tell you what they can and are able to do, right? So two, disability income is hardly evenly distributed. And it's typically not enough to live on, right? It's actually typically extremely low. And as, I don't remember if it's in McCrew or if it's in Bailey and Mobley, but they talk about the fact that disability income is tied to previous income, and the fact that Black individuals, right, Black workers get paid less on average than white workers, but Black women get paid less than Black men, get paid less than white women, get paid less than white men, right? Means that disproportionately levels of Social Security disability income, which correspond to a percentage of what that previous income was. It doesn't match it. It's a percentage of what it was, means that it will disproportionately be lower as well, right? So this idea that people are living high on the hog because they're able to claim a disability, which that language in and of itself, right, assumes that people are lying about a disability, right? Or that we can't believe people when they talk about their health and their own bodies, right? Right. The fact that, or the claim that people are living well on their disability income is a myth, and a dangerous and problematic one at that. So in the US, our system punishes you if you take on work that you are able to do, right? And you want to participate in this mode of productivity, right? And you need to make ends meet because your SSDI doesn't quite cut it, right? You're punished for taking on work in the same way that if you are on unemployment, which also does not cover the basic cost of living in most cases. They want you to find work, but if you get work, even if you get part-time work, they then cut your unemployment earnings, right? So rather than letting you get financially stable, they just increase your precarity, and they actually disincentivize they make it so that it is not a logical cost benefit to work, right? They disincentivize working because they punish you for it. So this idea that of laziness is actually not, it actually blames people for a structural problem, rather than saying, oh yeah, we actually disincentivize this entirely. It's part of the system. So that's another one of sort of the ways in which it's not exactly how the system works, right? So when they're talking about privilege, they're talking about it in this sort of tongue-in-cheek way. They are taking issue with it and pointing to these paradoxes, right? We'll have to end it there. There are some examples. I wanted to share with you this. I'm just going to share it real quick so you can see it. This was going on earlier in the year, there was a piece done on it on NPR recently, but it was also in like the Houston Chronicle and a number of other places. about a quadriplegic man's death during COVID raises the worst fears of many people with disabilities. And I just wanted to share with you, right? So this is a recording of this man's wife with his doctor, right? So he was a quadriplegic. He had been in an accident that that limited his that resulted in paralysis of his limbs, but he was able to still live a full life, right? And was living a full life, right? So on June 5th, medical staff had something to tell Melissa Hickson. They were going to stop treating her husband. So he was in the hospital. They were just going to stop treating him and move him from ICU to hospice care, right? So they had decided that hospice care is reserved for people who are going to die. He was not dying. He was not actively dying, right? But they decided that they were going to stop treating him. In the hallway, Melissa Hickson, his wife, found the doctor. She asked why and recorded the conversation. So the decision is, do we want to be extremely aggressive with his care? Why wouldn't you be extremely aggressive with his care, right? Or do we feel like this would be futile? Again, deciding whose life is worth saving and whose life is not, right? And then he adds, as of right now, his quality of life, he doesn't have much of one. Melissa Hickson challenges the doctor and says, what do you mean? Because he's paralyzed with a brain injury, he doesn't have a quality of life? And the doctor replies, correct, right? So the assumption is that because he is a disabled man who lives with a brain injury, right? Right, who is not brain damaged, but who has a brain injury. There are a number of football players running around and rugby players, right, running around with traumatic brain injuries. There are a number of veterans running around with traumatic brain injuries, right? So a brain injury is not the same as brain death, right? So that's an important distinction. So because he's paralyzed and has a brain injury, he doesn't have a quality of life. And the doctor says yes, right? Then the doctor says, it gives a different explanation. If we have to intubate him and put him on a more powerful ventilator, in his weakened condition, he's not going to survive. So he makes a determination, right? So there was no reason that there were, to believe that he was going to have to go onto a stronger, more powerful ventilator, or that his health was worsening, right? They just decided to stop treating him, right? They decided to stop feeding him and they decided to stop caring for him, right? So it raised these really intense concerns about quality of life, the good life, and compound the fact that this is a person with a disability, right, and one that is pathologized, right, with the fact that he's also a Black man, right, and medicine has not been kind to people of color, but especially Black people. Had this been a Black woman, it would have been even more intense, right? These are the kinds of things, these are the kinds of consequences, right? And so this is one of some of the issues that the Black feminist disability framework is trying to raise and argue against, and then also, like, it also helps us think about bodies in different ways, right? And to be open to the possibilities for other people's lives, right? So, all right, thank you for sticking with me for a few extra minutes today. We covered basically 2 classes worth in in this class. We will see you all on Monday. Again, early vote. Make sure that you get that done. It's been pretty quick and painless. I will also put a plug in if you are in DC and you're voting in DC. As a DC voter, vote yes on Prop 81. It's a pretty cool proposition. And as a medical anthropologist and somebody who is really concerned with indigenous healing practices and ethnobotanical medicine, super important. So we can talk about the politics of that particular proposition another time, but vote yes on that. If you are so inclined, you can vote how you want to, obviously. And don't forget, your blogs are due tomorrow. I'm looking forward to reading them. Thank you, and we will see you all next week. Bye.